That goop lady. What's her name? Gwyneth Paltrow. Yeah, that actress.
Dude, how's Georgia? How's being a fucking dad?
Good, man. Yeah, like I guess so. I haven't caught up since since before the birth, but turns out induction fucking sucks. They give this like hormone, but it's like a multi-day process and it's very painful, which we didn't realize. So it just makes everything very raw and sensitive, and they have to actually continue to replace it. But she's here. She's wonderful. She's just under 2 weeks now. She basically has to be feeding every 2 hours or so.
2 hours?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. They
did not realize.
Drink a lot of milk. It is wild. You don't think that these little, they're all, like, there's just these crazy little like alien things. They're so cute.
What's the biggest change? Like either schedule wise or just psychologically, like is anything drastically different?
Well, schedule is the big one. Psychologically, no. I think maybe that will happen later or maybe it won't ever happen. It just feels like a new thing in your life that you have to do. And so your schedule has just changed entirely. So that has been one of the challenges, is just figuring out like sleep routines and stuff, because Selena has to nap, but Georgia will only sleep like on top of me.
Oh, really?
I have to, because she likes the heartbeat and I think like the warmth, because that's cute. Like, I think it reminds her of being inside the womb.
I thought it was like 50-50 that you were just going to say, you know what, can't do the podcast anymore. I'm full-time parent now. All my priorities are shifted.
Yeah, dude.
Good luck with the podcast and everything.
It was a knife edge, but I decided at the last minute to keep plowing through. But yeah, what's going on your side?
Yeah, how the hell do you match that? I just asked you how it's being a new parent. Like, well, I, cooked some dumplings this week. And
well, what kind?
I had a friend go to EA Global.
Oh, yeah.
Which was like a conference this weekend. And she said some random dude from Copenhagen or something, the head of the EA Global group in Copenhagen, mentioned our podcast. Yeah.
No way.
Yeah, at least to her. I don't know if he mentioned it like to everyone, but he mentioned it.
So like, what was? Say more about that. Like,
she didn't say much. I didn't press her too many details, but he just, I guess, talking to her and just like mentioned it off the cuff, probably related to long-termism, I'm assuming.
The whole EA Global thing happened just last weekend, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I'm so curious about how much the long-termism aspect of EA was there, because from checking on the forums and stuff, it seems like there's less chatter about long-termism.
Yeah,
I think we should take all credit for that. But I'm very curious to know. But I'm very curious to know like what took place at EA Global, and if like we've been blowing this whole long-termism thing out of proportion, or if it is still a fairly dominant
I think
view.
I think it's still fairly dominant, and like Will is writing a book.
Still writing his book,
right? But like I think I'm less concerned about it now. I think now like people are still using the word long-termism, but I think most of the time they're just like focused on issues that I'm fine with, right? So like we were particularly concerned with like a form of reasoning that could theoretically be used to argue for like any sort of crazy subject matter, like any cause area that you wanted, basically. But I don't think that's actually what's happening in practice. I think people are sort of like buckling down in like nuclear security, pandemics,
awesome,
stuff like that. And so I think it's kind of, and I mean, even the AI safety stuff, like the AGI fears and whatnot are like somewhat out there. But if you look into like the stuff that like OpenPhil, for example, is funding, or like some of these stuff, a lot of the time it's just like very legit researchers that are just focusing on like robustness of ML systems. And that's like totally, that's legit. A great like research area, right? And like some of my own research and stuff touches on that. So there's sort of a weird cry where you have like out there language, but then when the money hits the ground, it's like going to people and causes that are just like totally legit and like definitely like improving the world. So
so one thing that I think is interesting about that is that machine learning culture I'm quite happy with, because of how empirical and data driven and open source it is too. A friend of mine works at DeepMind on an AI safety thing, and the AI safety is kind of just branding it, like one phrase in the first paragraph of their paper.
Exactly.
But then they use that to raise money, and then they switch to doing like legit work about robustness and like RL.
Yeah, exactly.
But here's something to consider, which like is a bit more close to the subject at hand. Like why are none of the climate models open source? That drives me crazy because the machine learning world, if you publish a figure or a graph or a model and then you don't show the code,
we beat your baseline, but
yeah, we beat your baseline, but we're not going to show you any of the code and how we did it. People will just laugh at you. And that is a cultural thing that I guess is kind of new in machine learning, but I'm so proud to be in a community where that is taken very seriously. But with these climate models, there's just these extreme prognostications that you are supposed to just take on faith. I just want to point that out because it's a different dimension of the whole should you or should you not trust climate models. And I think I'll trust them as soon as I can see the code.
Well, it's worse than that. They don't release code, but a lot of the data you can't even get your hands on, right? And so like I know Max Roser has recently been putting up a big fuss about this, as he should do, where he's like, oh, a lot of the best climate data we have is like locked behind paywalls and stuff, which is like just insane. Like if this is, if you're going to claim this is like an existential risk, we need all hands on deck worrying about this problem, and then you don't let people get their hands on the data, like what is happening? This is like a total market failure.
And it's purely just appeals to authority, this trust us thing. Anyway, that'll get us closer to the subject for today. But okay, let me get into like the fucking zone, and then we'll get to it. Someone, Robert Sapolsky, talked about how like cats and dogs will sometimes like spin in circles 10 times before they sleep. And like human beings do the same thing with like certain rituals that they have to do before they start. And I feel like I'm so like that. I just have to get up and do a walk around and then sit down before we start the main segment. Like even if I just have to squirt out like a little bit of pee, I still need to do it. Otherwise, I don't get in the zone.
We're making that the intro line for sure. Even if I just have to squirt out just a little bit of pee.
So thanks for indulging me. Yeah, so I am Vaden Masrani from the University of British Columbia. This is my good friend and conversation partner, Ben Chugg from Stanford University. And today we are continuing our series on climate change and doing a deep dive into fossil fuels. So I think this is going to be the beginning of like a 3-part series where we look at fossil fuels, renewable energy, and nuclear power, and kind of try to do a deep dive into each of them. I think we're going to have some guests on at some point. We keep promising this, but emails are being sent and responses are being collected, so we don't want to announce anything just yet. But our focus was going to be on Vaclav Smil's book, Oil, which we've both been reading this last week. And maybe a bit more context for the listener. Vaclav Smil is Bill Gates' favorite author, and he's widely known as like the energy expert, like alive today, University of Winnipeg. So he was born in the USSR, right? And I think right now he doesn't have a cell phone and lives a very simple life. He's a bit of an idiosyncratic dude.
Yeah. So just on that note, as I was reading the book is nice because he references a lot of external sources and just general phenomenon. So I'd always find myself going down rabbit holes. And in the course of that, I found an interview with him, a couple different interviews with him, and reading it caught me off guard completely. So have you ever had an experience where you're talking with someone at a party or something and you agree about some subject, and then you're like, you're vibing with one another, you're having a great time, and then you move the conversation on to some other topic and they say something that's like completely at odds with like some belief you have, and you have that moment of like, oh, this is interesting. Like, how am I going to respond?
I think I've done that to everybody I've talked to at parties before.
Or like, family reunion or anything. So this is exactly the kind of reaction I had with Smil, where I was reading his book and just loving how he's laying out these facts. And in general, I've gone to like a few of his books to reference various things as I've tried to make arguments in the past. And then reading these interviews, he's quite a pessimist, actually. He really thinks that he really kind of adopts the degrowth mindset with a few more nuances than what you often see in that community. Yeah, so I think a lot of his pessimism, as you said, comes from being very suspicious of leaders that are claiming that tomorrow is going to be better than today. So a quote from the interview in The Guardian says, "Having spent 26 years of my life in the evil empire, I do not tolerate nonsense. I grew up surrounded by commie propaganda, the bright tomorrow, the great future of mankind. So I'm as critical as they come. It's not my opinion. these are the facts. I don't write opinion pieces. I write things that are totally underlined by facts. And he does indeed do that. So his books are just like peppered with interesting facts. And he himself is very critical towards people who, in his view, misuse models to try and predict doom and gloom scenarios, right? So whether it's like peak oil or everything's going to collapse in 50 years and we're going to run out of reserves of energy, etc. He like spends a long time, he's written many articles himself explaining why like these models are nonsense, basically. And so I expected him to be more of an optimist, but imagine contrasting someone like him and Steven Pinker, right? So they would both be very harsh on like false prophets, basically, that are like prophesying the end of civilization based on like misreading of trends and stuff. And they would both be very in touch with how much better the world has gotten and currently what the problems are and where we're at. But Pinker sort of has this like a sort of faith in human creativity and our ability to solve problems, and it's quite optimistic. Whereas you can recognize all the same things Pinker does and still be very pessimistic.
Yeah.
And that is just not, I don't think you find that sort of person very often, or at least I hadn't come across that sort of person before, because I think when you look broadly at like all the problems we have solved previously, of course, that's not an indication that we will definitely solve the next problem, right? But I think it's hard to not be buoyed by that, to have your spirits be somewhat buoyed by that, right? And have that turn you into somewhat an optimist for the future. But Smil, he recognizes that we have this ability to solve problems and is still pessimistic, right?
Yeah.
That's what I find so interesting.
Yeah,
and that's just not a combination that I come across often, right? Often it's like people will just say Pinker's wrong, or like he doesn't understand the extent, the severity of today's problems. They're actually worse than yesterday's problems, or on par, like things haven't gotten that much better. And that's very common, but I'd love to have a beer with him. I think it'd be so much fun to go with a beer.
Yeah, and he's a very entertaining individual. Like when you watch YouTube videos of him speaking and stuff, and even in the interview you're referring to, he's just like a funny guy, and also a pessimist, and also just very sharp, and will critique the hell out of people.
Yeah, he's very hard on like the Bostrobites.
Yes. Yeah,
the AGI folks. Yeah,
he just, in the middle of the interview, he's like, that goop lady, what's her name? Gwyneth Paltrow. Yeah, that actress. This is unbelievable, right? The scientific version of goop. I just love so much that he asked what that goop lady was.
Yeah, I love that they kept that in.
Yeah. That goop lady. That's so good. So maybe we should get closer to the book. Yeah, so maybe a good place to start is just with some basic definitions and how we should taxonomize words like fossil fuels, petroleum, gasoline, oil, coal in our minds. And then I would love to discuss just the process of taking it out of the ground and turning it into useful things. Because from a scientific perspective, it's so fascinating. And then later in the conversation, let's get to all of the more controversial political stuff, which, again, we can assume our listeners have strong opinions about, but we can also assume that that's all they've really heard about oil in the public conversation. So it'll be fun to just talk about it from a scientific perspective first, I think. So like if you imagine a branching tree, at the very top, we have the category of fossil fuels. And so fossil fuels come in basically three different states: solid, liquid, gas. So solid is coal, liquid is oil, and gas is natural gas. Where do fossil fuels come from? Fossils, obviously. And what you have is sunlight creating plants through the process of photosynthesis. And then these plants decay, and over hundreds and hundreds of millions of years, they get pressurized and turn into fossil fuels. So it's pressurized sunlight is what fossil fuels are. And so I thought that would be a nice kind of neutral place to start before we get into the more controversial stuff.
Yeah, neutral unless you're Russian-Ukrainian. Did you,
okay, that was interesting.
That's so fascinating. I'd never heard about this before. Yeah. So it turns out it's not entirely settled science how crude oils are formed. Right. So fossil fuels, as you said, we have coal, we have like the solids, then we have natural gases, and then the liquids are crude oils. And then crude oils themselves can be broken down into like heavier and lighter variants. But I guess the theory that's most common in like the West and most of the world until you get into Russia is exactly like you said. So it's like big stores of organic material that over time compresses into rocks. These rocks then like start sinking into the Earth's crust. And this, as they get lower, pressure builds up and temperature builds up. And then these rocks get compressed together, and you get geochemical reactions that start producing these hydrocarbons. And depending on the temperature, the hydrocarbons are either like crude oils, or at higher temperatures, they're natural gases and stuff. Whereas there's another theory that oils are actually formed in the Earth's mantle, which I believe is the layer. So there's like Earth's core, then mantle, then crust, going from in to out. And so there's like another theory that they're actually made in the mantle and then rise up towards the crust over time. And this second school of thought is called abiogenesis, I think. Is that the word he uses, right? Which is weird because I've only heard that with respect to like generating life from from non-life before, but
no. So I think that makes sense because A means like without that, right?
Right. So it's without the photosynthetic component. Interesting. Okay. So I get, the second theory is very common, or at least originates in like the Russian-Ukrainian school. It's a little bit hard to tell, but it doesn't seem like this is a completely heterodox theory, right? So there's like many papers published about this. It's actually, this theory has been used to predict where oil will be, and it's been vindicated to some extent. I don't know. It's interesting that like this process that we're like using to keep the energy of this Earth system afloat, we like still don't entirely agree on like where these things are coming from.
The way that Smil describes it is that this is not mainstream opinion, but it's also not totally quack either. So, okay, so then you use the word crude oil. So what crude oil is a mixture of a bunch of different hydrocarbons of different chain lengths. So at the top you have light hydrocarbons, so butane. Then you have gasoline. Then you have naphtha. Then you have kerosene. Then you have diesel and heating oils. And then you have heavy gas oil. And then you have the residual products. And the residual products tend to be turned into asphalt. And one thing that's interesting, and I like finding little factoids that force contradictions in people's mind. So it's oil companies that invented the process of recycling. Because when oil was first discovered, the only thing that people could find that was useful was getting kerosene to create lamp oil. But the rest of the liquid was just considered waste product. And so one of the reasons oil is so valuable is because we have figured out ways to make use of every aspect of the waste product, such that there no longer is any waste products. So plastic, we'll eventually get to the subject of plastic, but people should know that plastic is by definition recycled because it is a byproduct of stuff that we use, fuels. And what you're left with is this residual material out of which we make plastic. So plastic should be thought of initially as a recycled material.
While we're on the historical point, so let's just walk through the different uses of different parts of the crude oils at different times. So at first, like you said, we only knew how to use the lightest parts of the oils, which was like you said, the kerosene. And this was mostly for like lamp oil and stuff. And then over time, so this is like 1860s, 1870s, but then kerosene slowly got replaced by electricity because it was more efficient. So that was like coal and stuff. And then, but like into the 1880s and 1890s, that's when the first automobiles started being developed. And then obviously like Model T, 1905, I think, was like the big Henry Ford Model T. And that's when the lighter parts of the oil, slightly heavier than kerosene, but lighter than that heaviest sludge and stuff, was really useful for internal combustion engines. And so this obviously exploded the world of oil, made it very commercially viable and very in demand. And so oil prices spiked and stuff at this time. And then over time, we started realizing that heavier oils could be used for different kinds of engines, like diesel engines and stuff, which are actually more efficient. And there's like an interesting historical contingency there where like, I guess many more cars in Europe are diesel, whereas like in North America, that's not true. The majority are still regular gasoline.
Where the difference is that combustion engines require a spark, where diesel is a heavier fuel and can combust through pressure. Right. So I guess Smil makes the point that you tend to prefer diesel in places where if it was to combust, it would be very bad. So like airplanes and
ships and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think diesel is in general more efficient, although combustion engines have been getting more efficient over the last, say, 50, 60 years, such that the difference is now fairly narrow. But two different engines which make use of two different refined products from crude oil.
I guess diesel engines are also more expensive and heavier. So that's possibly why they're used less, especially in small cars.
Yeah, absolutely. Somewhere he says near the beginning that modern life begins and ends with oil because hospitals are filled with plastics. And I love that kind of inversion because you think he's speaking metaphorically, but he's actually speaking literally. Then he gives the examples of surgical gloves, flexible tubing, catheters, IV containers, sterile packages, trays, bins, bedpans, rails, thermal blankets, and labware. Not to mention the electricity, which keeps the hospital running. And then you can just think about all the plastics in schools, and you can think about the asphalt that you drive your car on to get to school and to hospital. And so one interpretation of this is how corrupt and deeply entrenched oil is in our consumerist capitalist life. Another interpretation is this is how unbelievably ingenious the human brain is, that it can turn a substance which we in the past thought was useless into all of these materials which we use around us every day. And I guess I find it's very important to think about what plastics and oil were replacing, because previously people would say use tortoise shells and use ivory and use the raw material from actual animals. And now we are drilling into the earth and finding products that replace animal products. And all things considered, this is a good thing. Again, it has its downsides, but we should just keep in mind when we think about oil, what it's replacing.
Yeah, nice. Okay, so let's just linger on the uses of oil while we're here. So coming back to like asphalt and transportation. So he says in the US, 98% of all energy used in transportation is from crude oil. 98%. So the transportation, this would be like roads, constructing cars, and then actual oil for cars, gasoline and diesel. And then worldwide, it's 95%. So, to what you were saying there, before we had cars, everyone was riding around on horses, and we had streets overflowing with horse dung, and New York City smelled awful, right? So if you like read reports of New York City before the introduction of cars, it sounds like a horrendous place. But so this is a huge transformation that oil was able to catalyze in the transportation industry. But he says arguably the biggest transformation was not actually in transportation, but in agriculture.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So traditionally, if you take like all available labor of people, traditional agriculture subsumed 80% of this labor. So of all the labor we produce in the human labor, 80% of it is going towards agriculture. Now we're down to about 2%. In 1900, we needed about 3 minutes to produce 1 kilogram of wheat. By 2000, it's down to 2 seconds, sometimes 1 second, depending on where you are in the world. And so it has seriously revolutionized the work that is like available for humans. And if you're not the kind of person who wants to spend all day on a farm, then we should be somewhat thankful for the role oil has played in our lives here.
And just on the New York point, he talks about how they used to pave their roads with brick, granite, and wood block. And so again, just imagine the toll on the environment we would be taking if we needed to pave our roads with wood.
So I kind of want to talk a little bit about, we referenced it, but like source rocks and reservoir rocks and stuff. So like how oil is actually sitting in the ground, because I had this image in my head that somehow it's just kind of like sitting in pools underground. Like you would like go into a cavern and there's like a lake of oil or something. And that's how I pictured all these oil wells and stuff. And then we're just trying to locate these like basically lakes and then just like drill the oil up. But I guess that's actually not very common. So he says it's rare to find like bodies of oil, basically like an underground lake. And most of the time oil is actually sitting in rocks. And so these are called like reservoir rocks, and they're kind of like holding the oil in place and like trapping it. And so the rocks that they like to sit in have to be high. They have to be highly porous. And so that just kind of means like a cavernous rock, like think of like a big cave where like oil can like get in and stuff, and then highly permeable, so that when we put pressure on the rock, it will actually come out, and then we can like suck it up and use it. So as we were saying earlier, like as the oil, well, depending on which theory you buy, it either kind of like sinks down in rocks or like rises up. So the hydrocarbons that compose crude oil, they get squeezed out of what's called source rocks, and then they travel underground. So they go through like various pathways, and they often rise because oils are very light. And so if there's like water and stuff, it'll push the oil upward. And then hopefully, for our case, they get trapped in these reservoir rocks. And that's where we can actually find it. But oftentimes that doesn't actually happen. So oftentimes it'll just like seep away and dissolve into the soil, or like sometimes rise up to the surface. And so it's estimated that only like 10% of the actual oil produced by these source rocks actually get trapped by reservoir rocks. And so of all the oil we're actually consuming, there's like 90% more that's being produced that we can't actually use because it just like dilutes throughout the earth.
Yeah, well, so this gets us to why the hydraulic fracturing revolution over the last, I guess, like 20 years is so important, right? Because the stuff that rises the most are the lighter chemicals. So that's where you get your natural gases.
Right.
And it's trapped in the rock. And what hydraulic fracturing is like, actually, so when I saw Smil, actually went to go see him speak. And this was 5-6 years ago. But what he said was so cool is that you have this idea of a drill just being like straight down, right?
Right.
But it's actually horizontal drilling. But it's actually, think of it as like a snake, which can make like an S shape horizontally, and it can follow the seams of these rocks.
Oh, wow.
And what hydraulic fracturing is you make this like, so the listener, I'm making like a waving motion with my hand, which you obviously can't see, but imagine following a seam horizontally, and then you put some, I think just water pressure and some explosives. This is where my knowledge is breaking down, to fracture the rock.
I don't think they actually use explosives. I think it's just water mixed with like some salts and stuff.
But then what causes the fracturing?
Yeah, so it's what they call a high pressure injection. So they basically just bore a well, and then like through this snake-like thing you're talking about, just keep injecting fluid, and the pressure builds up, and then boom.
Nice. Cool. Very cool. So what that does is it cracks all the rocks, and then you get a lot of this trapped, methane and butane. I feel like there's 3. Aren't there not 3? This is just bugging me. Ethane. Methane, ethane, methane and ethane. Then you have propane and butane is what I found on Wikipedia, and then pentane, but who the hell has heard of pentane? Yeah, we should issue the caveat maybe right at the beginning that we are clearly not geologists. And so if there are any geologists listening who are hearing us struggle through all this, 1, forgive us. 2, we're trying. The other, so one thing that Smil talks about a lot is energy transitions. So the energy transition, which Smil talks about, is how we as a society have moved from primarily coal to primarily oil, which is what we're currently at now. And we're moving towards a natural gas society. And this is an improvement. This is good. I guess one of the reasons why natural gas has taken so long to get widely adopted is because it's hard to transport. So you'll often hear about people talk about liquid natural gas. And that is the process of cooling the gas down to like minus 160 degrees Celsius, such that it's liquid, such that it's able to be shipped long distances.
And speaking of energy transitions, like one of the largest is just how we've been heating our homes. So we started from like solid fuels and like obviously like burning wood and coal, and then to like fuel oils and stuff. And then recently now to natural gas, which obviously we're trying to like move off of natural gas up the energy portfolio, but natural gas is much better for the environment than when we were all heating our homes with solid fuels and coals.
Yeah. So on the fracking point, I can imagine people saying, well, what about earthquakes and what about gas in drinking water? And that's all true. These things have happened. But as we start developing this technology more, we learn how to use it better. So incremental progress, baby. We have a new technology. It has some downsides. We learn about the extent of these downsides, and we address it slowly, patiently, with a combination of better technology and better regulation. So just to fully acknowledge that fracking has its downsides. And as we use the technology more, we learn more about it, and we figure out ways to ameliorate these consequences.
Nice.
Another huge dimension of the oil subject is the politics around it.
Let's do it.
So in 2015, the 4 largest oil companies were from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Iran, Venezuela, not countries with, say, stellar human rights records. And so the fact that they have so much power is because of the global dependence on oil. Or let me phrase that. The global dependence on oil is the reason they have so much geopolitical influence, and also the reason why we say can't pressure Saudi Arabia to improve its human rights standards in the way it treats women, for example. When we talk about reasons to try to move past fossil fuels, one predominant one has to be the geopolitical influence of these, say, countries with very poor human rights records.
Yeah, so just some background on the political economy. So as it is right now, it's sort of like state-owned corporations that control a lot of the oil production, especially in like the Persian Gulf and Middle East and stuff. But that was not always the case. So in like the 80s-ish, the major dominance was just like big multinational oil companies. And there were like 7 of them, Exxon and those stuff. And they were called the Seven Sisters, I guess. This was like well before my time. You might remember it on the other hand.
Old. Far.
Yeah. So these companies together controlled like 85% of the reserves. And now it's down to like 15%. The remnants of these companies, some have merged and some have split off and stuff. But now it's like Esso and ExxonMobil, and these are like the grandchildren of these 7 sister companies. But the market is now dominated by these state-owned companies, and mostly by OPEC, right? Which is sort of a conglomerate or like a cartel of mostly producers from the Middle East and stuff. There's, like you said, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Iran, Venezuela. Was first headquartered in Baghdad, but now is in Austria, even though Austria is not a part of it, which is interesting. And there's some new members now, but I forget who it is. It's just an interesting, it's an interesting example, I guess, of like just outright like monopoly, right? It's like a classic go-to economics example of a monopoly on a product. That reduces competition because they have so much market power that they can just, if another producer starts gaining prominence, they can reduce or raise prices in order to like drive them out of the market, in order to maintain an absolute monopoly on production.
Just to add on that, so now that we're getting to some of the big downsides of oil, I'm just going to read a quote here. So, a free market has not been one of the hallmarks of the 150 year of oil's commercial history. The oil business has seen repeated efforts to fix product prices by controlling either the level of crude oil extraction or by dominating its transportation and processing, or by monopolizing all of these aspects. So this is, I think, important because I know some of us think we're just right-wing shills who are the mouthpieces of big oil, so right wing that we're free marketeers. Well, absolutely not. Like, oil is a good example of where the free market cannot be left to its own devices historically. You need some governmental organization that is going to break up big monopolies because it has a long and sordid history of tampering with the free market. So I think this is one place where Alex Epstein, I think, goes a bit too far, where I think he's fairly to the free market will do everything and just trust the free market, where Smil gives some nice historical examples of just that you need a combination of governmental intervention and environmental regulation to prevent crony capitalism.
Yeah, especially because, I mean, the market can't overcome where the resources are being found.
Nice.
So the majority, the oil reserves predominantly rely on like Persian Gulf and places like this, and so are naturally being produced in like Saudi Arabia, etc. And so trying to naturally, if these companies, especially the countries with the largest oil reserves, band together, this is like something the market can't really overcome on its own. Naturally, that's going to form a monopoly. And so you need some sort of, unfortunately, it's very hard in this case because you need some sort of international organization to try and break it up, right? This isn't just like a case of a national government being able to step in and do something. So this is like geopolitically a very difficult issue to deal with.
Maybe now is a good point to start going into some of the environmental costs, because that's a huge component of oil. So he says that photochemical smog was first observed in Los Angeles in the 1940s, and its origins were soon traced primarily to automotive emissions. As car use progressed around the world, all major urban areas began to experience seasonal or near permanent levels of smog, where seasonal levels of smog you see in Toronto and Paris, and near permanent levels of smog you see in Bangkok and Cairo. And the effects ranged from impaired health, so irritation of the eyes and lungs, to damage to materials, crops, and coniferous trees. A recent epidemiological study in California also demonstrated that the lung function of children living within 500 meters of a freeway was seriously impaired, and that this adverse effect could result in significant lung capacity deficits later in life. And now extreme smog levels are regularly experienced in Beijing, New Delhi, and other major Chinese and Indian cities, arising from a combination of both traffic and large-scale coal combustion to generate electricity plants. So this is a serious downside of fossil fuels, and there's absolutely no excuse for it. But Smil then talks a bit about what has helped to reduce some of these problems. So one of them is the introduction of a catalytic converter in cars, which helped to limit smog levels. The other is regulation. So phasing out lead from gasoline helped a lot. And like we mentioned earlier, the transition from coal generating electrical plants to oil and then natural gas are also helping. But this is a serious downside with the burning of fossil fuels, and one which is one of the primary reasons why we need to get past it. On the subject of oil spills, we mentioned this in a previous episode, but the good news with oil spills is that the frequency of both large and small spills has been constantly declining since the 1970s. And then the additional fact, which I thought was interesting, is that now we're well below the amount of oil that naturally seeps into the ocean from naturally occurring reservoirs. So oil spills are a problem, and we need to continue to reduce them, but we're now spilling oil into the ocean less than Mother Nature is spilling oil into the ocean.
But that's also, from what I understand, in aggregate, right? Like oil spills still cause severe damage because they're concentrated.
Fantastic
And
point.
I think there's still there's big environmental impacts even years later that you can see because of the concentration of oil all at once.
Yeah, which is another benefit of natural gas over oil, because natural gas evaporates. So if you move natural gas via a pipeline and you have a leak, it evaporates and you don't have ecological destruction just in the local vicinity. Obviously, methane is a greenhouse gas, so you have some cost there. But
when natural gas is moved in pipelines, it's in gaseous form or it's liquefied?
No, it's liquefied. So
I guess so. But if there's a pipeline spill and natural gas is in liquid form, it will spill, but then it'll just evaporate because it's liquid only because it's highly pressurized, right? So it'll basically evaporate like right away. It would turn.
Yeah, exactly.
Right away, yeah. So let's talk a bit about how oil is found. This was another surprising little section for me because the science is less precise than I actually would have imagined for such a global industry. So, even the most modern forms of oil exploration, I guess, cannot at all guarantee that you won't drill into the ground and just find an empty well where you thought there would be oil. And that happens pretty often and will cost a company $15 to $20 million, he says. So one older technique that I think is still in use somewhat is what's called, so there's seismic techniques. And so what we mean here is just basically you're at the surface, and this can be done on land or over water, and you generate sound waves and you point them at the ground. Sound waves go up and then they rebound off of things in the earth. And based on where their location, how deep they are, and also their material, they'll rebound at like different rates. And so using how long it took to get the signal back to register the rebound, you can start developing like maps of what's going on under there. He's got a cool image in the book actually of like them doing this over water. So you'll have a big ship that's towing this like gigantic line of like sensors, and the ship is shooting out sound waves into the ocean. And based on what it encounters, it then rebounds back up and hits the sensors. And based on how long it took to register on the sensors, they can map how deep the water is and what like the subterranean landscape really looks like. And then the second most common way is what's called electric well logging. And this is where you think you're at a place where you might have a reservoir, and you basically like stick a long cable into the ground and you register things like electric currents. So you could like shoot electricity in and then measure the current, and just like isotope decay and stuff. And depending what's underground and what minerals and how much decay you find there, how much radioactive decay, you can also map what's going on under there. And oil has like a certain spectral signature and stuff. And so apparently this is still not an exact science at all, which
was a lot of guesswork.
Which is just so interesting, right? It's like we're so sophisticated in some ways, but we're still like just guessing a lot of the time. So interesting.
Totally. Well, I think it's a place, I haven't looked into this, but it would be a place I'd guess where Bayesian methods would be quite useful, because you could put priors over, like, say, a 2D spatial map of where you think oil is going to be, and then you drill and get a data point, and then that can shift your prior, and then you can start drilling in different places based on that. So just a nice example of where Bayesian methods would be valuable. So getting to the end of the book and getting to the end of the episode, he brings up the subject of peak oil. So peak oil is a big one, because people have been predicting for as long as people have been predicting that oil is going to end and that we're going to run out of resources. And this is just not the case. So why is this not the case? Ben, take it away.
Well, you might be able to infer this is not the case because we still have to look for where all the oil is. So at a basic level, we don't have the entire Earth mapped out in terms of like where oil is, because that's just very hard to do. And so we're constantly discovering new reservoirs and stuff. And because we don't have complete knowledge, all the forecasts about how much oil is left in the ground and how quickly we're going to use it are always subject to just new information coming in.
Yeah. Nice.
And because, we've talked about tons of times on the podcast, we just can't foresee the future in this way. And so there are often oil spikes and we'll discover new reservoirs that we didn't foresee. And because of this, basically every prediction for peak oil that we've seen to date has been falsified. And Smil has a couple paragraphs where he just runs through all the ones that have turned out to be totally invalid.
Also, there's this like idea that oil extraction is like putting a straw into a milkshake and just like slurping it until you start hearing gurgles. But it's not that way at all. It's that as the milkshake in this metaphor starts to get smaller and smaller, the cost of extraction starts to get higher and higher. But if we ever got to a point where we ran out of oil, then the value of that last bit would increase significantly, and people would then be motivated to get more of it. So there's economic forces which just keep things balanced. And additionally, this is the resource point which Alex Epstein has made, which is that resources aren't something we discover, resources are something we create. Because as we come up with new ideas that can allow us to transform physical material in ways that are beneficial to us, the thing which we consider a resource will continuously change. Like in a glass of water, we know just from Einstein that there's enough energy to power the entire world if only we figured out how to unlock it. So this idea that we run out of resources is just a misunderstanding about how resources work, because it isn't as if God serves us up something of value on a plate and we just scarf it down until we run out of it. It's that we create value out of raw material, and there is no limit to human ingenuity. And so just this idea that we're going to run out of any resource is a fallacy, because we're continuously running into resources as we discover and create new ways of using them.
Yeah. Earlier we talked a bit about market failures and how that's shaded the history of fossil fuels. But in this case, the price mechanism is actually very useful for this, because as soon as things start getting very, very expensive, that does encourage innovation. And so, I sound like some sort of capitalist shill, but honestly, the price mechanism is like a genius invention by humans. And it really serves to spur innovation when it's needed.
Perhaps we should end in the place that Smil ends, which is a brief discussion of how we could perhaps get beyond fossil fuels. And that will maybe lead us nicely to the next subject, which is either going to be renewables or nuclear power. We don't know which yet. So one point that Smil makes is, and I think he himself was actually surprised about this, which is interesting, is electric cars and renewable energy and the storage problem. So he says that, yes, with renewable energy, there is this problem of storage, but surprisingly, it could work very nicely with electric cars, which are themselves storage sources. So you could imagine in, say, 50, 60 years, you don't run entire cities off renewables. That wouldn't be feasible. But you could imagine cities are run on nuclear and then using renewable energy to power the transportation sector. So there's a nice coupling of electric cars being storage and the storage problem with renewable energies pairing together. So you could imagine a society where we extract much less oil from the ground and we use it mainly to meet the demand of those oil products which we can't get elsewhere. So plastics and then we use primarily natural gas where we need to for combustion, and we use renewables and electric cars for transportation, and nuclear for cities.
Yeah, beautiful way to close it out. There's lots in the book that we haven't covered, even lots of interesting tidbits in my notes that we haven't covered. So it's well worth just having the book around, just as good reference material. You can just read a few pages and there's just some astonishing facts on each one. So I highly recommend just buying the book to just have around. But yeah, with that, any last words?
It'll be interesting to see what the reaction to this episode is, because I think somewhere Christopher Hitchens said it was people describe it as almost a bodily secretion, that they're just so infuriated and disgusted with the substance, which is actually unbelievably interesting from a scientific perspective, from a civilizational development perspective, and from a geopolitical perspective. And so as a subject, I think it's fascinating, and hopefully we have made a tiny step forward in demystifying it and taking the temperature down one notch. We'll see.
That was great.
Well, see you next time.